The scream cut through the night before Elena Hartwell even understood why she was running. Her bare feet hit the cold gravel path behind her house, her breath coming out in sharp clouds, and her heart slammed against her ribs so hard it hurt. Something inside her chest was clawing to get out, and she pressed her hand against her sternum as if she could hold it in by force alone. She had felt this before. Every single time the moon grew round and heavy in the sky, the same fire lit under her skin, and every single time she fought it back down into the dark corner of herself where it belonged. 20 years. 20 years of swallowing this thing whole. She reached the old wooden fence at the edge of her property and gripped it until her knuckles turned white. Her vision sharpened in a way that human eyes were never supposed to sharpen. She could see the individual leaves trembling on the birch trees 50 feet away. She could hear a rabbit's heartbeat somewhere in the brush. She could smell rain that hadn't fallen yet. None of this was supposed to be possible. None of this was supposed to be her life. Not tonight, she whispered to herself, the way she always did, like a small prayer repeated so many times it had worn smooth. Not tonight. Please, not tonight. She thought of her mother, of the woman who had raised her alone in this quiet town, who had taught her how to breathe through the burning, how to count backward from 100, how to press her tongue against the roof of her mouth until the urge to change passed. Her mother had died 4 years ago, but her voice still lived inside Elena's head, calm and steady even in memory. Hide it, always hide it. If they find out what you are, they will either kill you or own you, and neither one is a life worth living. Elena had believed those words with her whole heart for as long as she could remember. She still believed them, but belief did not make the fire in her blood any easier to bear. She forced herself to breathe slowly, in through her nose, out through her mouth, the way she had practiced 1,000 times. Slowly, the wildness in her chest began to settle, like a wave pulling back from the shore. Her vision dimmed back to something ordinary. Her heartbeat found its normal rhythm again. She stood there in the cool night air for a long moment, shaking slightly, and then she turned around and walked back inside her small house as though nothing unusual had happened at all. This was Elena's life. She worked at a small bookstore on Maple Street, in a town called Hollow Pine, that sat right on the edge of a vast, quiet forest. She kept to herself. She had 2 friends, if she was being generous with the word, and she never let either of them get too close. She never dated. She never stayed anywhere long enough to be truly known. She had built her whole existence around one single rule: never let anyone see what you really are. For 20 years that rule had kept her safe. But safety, she was about to learn, was not the same thing as freedom, and freedom was about to come looking for her whether she wanted it to or not. The next morning, Hollow Pine was buzzing with a kind of nervous energy Elena had never felt in her small town before. She noticed it the moment she stepped outside her front door. People were standing in clusters on the sidewalks, speaking in hushed, excited voices. A line of black cars had been spotted driving in from the northern road, the road that led toward the deep forest territory that the locals had always quietly understood belonged to someone else, some other kind of authority that nobody discussed in polite company. Elena had grown up hearing whispers about the forest, stories that parents told their children to keep them from wandering too far past the tree line, stories about creatures that walked on 2 legs but were not entirely human, about a hidden world of packs and territories that existed just beyond the edge of everyday life. She had always assumed these stories were exaggerated, folklore stretched thin over some old, half-forgotten truth. She had never expected to learn, in the quietest and most devastating way, that every single one of them was true. She was Elena, but she was also something else, something her mother had called an old and broken bloodline, mixed and hidden and hunted long before Elena was ever born. She did not fully understand what she was. She only understood that she had to hide it, always, from everyone. "Did you hear?" Nora Bennett said, catching up to Elena on the sidewalk with her usual breathless energy. Nora worked at the flower shop 2 doors down from the bookstore, and she was the closest thing Elena had to a real friend in Hollow Pine. "Someone important is in town, like really important. My cousin works at the inn, and she said the man who checked in last night gave off this vibe like he owned the whole street just by standing on it." "People don't own streets, Nora," Elena said, forcing a light laugh into her voice even as something cold moved through her stomach. "You know what I mean, presence, like a king or something." Nora laughed at her own joke, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "Anyway, he's supposedly investigating something. A few hikers went missing near the old ridge trail last month, remember? Maybe he's here about that." Elena's stomach tightened further. She did remember the missing hikers. She remembered the strange, unsettled feeling she'd had reading about it in the local paper. The sense that something was wrong in a way the article couldn't quite explain. She had told herself it was nothing. "Well, I hope they find whoever did it," Elena said, and meant it. even as a small, traitorous part of her wondered whether the answer to that mystery had anything to do with the fire she kept locked inside her own chest. She said goodbye to Nora and walked the rest of the way to the bookstore alone, trying to shake the uneasy feeling that had settled over the whole town like a fog. She told herself it was nothing to do with her. Important people came and went. Investigations happened. None of it had anything to do with a woman who spent her life making herself as small and unremarkable as possible. She was wrong, of course, though she would not understand exactly how wrong until later that afternoon. The bookstore was quiet, the way it usually was on weekday mornings, filled with the comforting smell of old paper and the low hum of the ceiling fan. Elena liked the quiet. She liked being surrounded by stories that belonged to other people, safely printed and bound. Nothing like the messy, uncontrollable story that lived inside her own body. She spent the morning shelving a new delivery of novels, and for a little while, she almost forgot about the strange energy buzzing through town. Almost. The bell above the door chimed just after noon, and Elena looked up out of habit, the same polite, welcoming smile already forming on her face. The smile faltered the moment her eyes landed on the man standing in the doorway. He was tall, with the kind of stillness that seemed to fill the entire room the second he stepped into it. His dark hair was cut close, his jaw sharp, his eyes an unusual pale gray that seemed to catch and hold every bit of light in the store. He wore simple clothes, nothing flashy, nothing that should have made him stand out. And yet Elena felt, immediately and instinctively, that every hair on her arms had risen, that some deep, animal part of her had gone completely still, the way prey goes still when it senses a predator nearby. She did not know his name yet. She would learn it soon enough. Kate Ashwood, a name that would come to mean everything to her, though in that first moment, standing behind the counter with her heart suddenly pounding for reasons she could not explain, she only knew him as a stranger who made her wolf sit up and pay attention for the first time in 20 years. "Good afternoon," she managed, proud of how steady her voice sounded, despite the chaos happening beneath her ribs. "Can I help you find something?" He did not answer right away. Instead, his gray eyes moved over her slowly, thoughtfully, the way someone studies a puzzle they suspect is more complicated than it first appears. Elena forced herself to hold his gaze, to keep her expression pleasant and unremarkable, even as every instinct in her body screamed that this man could see straight through the careful mask she had spent 2 decades perfecting. "I'm looking for a book on local history," he said finally, his voice low and even. "Specifically anything about the old boundaries around this town, the original land divisions." It was an innocent enough request. Elena told herself it was an innocent enough request. She led him toward the small history section near the back of the store, very aware of the careful distance she kept between them, very aware of how he seemed to notice that distance too. "We have a few books that touch on that," she said, running her finger along the spines until she found what she was looking for. "This one has a whole chapter on how the town was originally settled, and how the forest boundary was decided." She turned to hand him the book and found him closer than she expected, close enough that she caught the scent of him, clean and sharp like pine and cold air, and beneath it, something else entirely, something wild, something that made the wolf inside her chest lift its head and go utterly, dangerously still. His eyes narrowed slightly, just for a moment, and Elena's blood ran cold. She saw it happen. She saw the exact instant his expression shifted from polite curiosity into something far more focused, far more searching. He had smelled something on her too, something that should not have been there. "Thank you," he said, taking the book from her hands with careful, deliberate slowness, his gray eyes never leaving hers. "You've been very helpful." He paid for the book and left without another word, the bell above the door chiming softly behind him. Elena stood frozen behind the counter for a long moment, her hands trembling slightly at her sides, her mind racing through every possible explanation for what had just happened, and finding none of them comforting. He had noticed something. She was almost certain of it. 20 years of careful hiding, and one stranger walking into her bookstore had come closer to unraveling her secret in 5 minutes than anyone else ever had in her entire life. She spent the rest of her shift glancing toward the front window every few minutes, half expecting to see him standing outside, watching her. He never appeared. But the feeling of being watched did not leave her. Not when she closed the shop for the evening. Not when she walked home along the quiet, tree-lined streets of Hollow Pine. Not even when she locked her front door behind her and leaned against it, breathing hard, as though she had been running for miles instead of walking a few short blocks. That night, the moon rose full and bright over Hollow Pine, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Elena Hartwell did not sleep at all. She lay awake in the dark, listening to the wind move through the trees outside her window, and she thought about gray eyes that seemed to see too much, and a stranger whose scent had made something ancient inside her stir awake after 20 long years of silence. She did not yet know his name. She did not yet know what he was, or what he would come to mean to her life. She only knew, with a certainty that frightened her more than anything else ever had, that the careful, quiet world she had built for herself was about to change forever, and there was absolutely nothing she could do to stop it. The knock on Elena's door came at 7 the next morning, sharp and confident, and her whole body went rigid before she had even crossed the room to answer it. She peered through the small window beside the door and felt her stomach drop straight to her feet. Standing on her porch, dressed in the same simple dark clothes as the day before, was the stranger from the bookstore. Cade Ashwood, though she still did not know his name yet, stood with his hands loosely at his sides, his pale gray eyes fixed on the door, as though he could already sense her standing on the other side of it. Elena considered for one wild moment simply not answering, but some instinct told her that ignoring him would only make things worse, that a man like this did not simply walk away because a door stayed closed. She smoothed down her shirt, took one steadying breath, and opened the door with a calm expression she did not feel at all. "Can I help you?" she asked, proud again of how normal her voice sounded. "I hope I'm not intruding," he said, and there was something almost careful in the way he said it, as though he had rehearsed the words to sound less alarming than his presence actually was. "My name is Cade. I wanted to properly introduce myself, since I'll be in town for a little while." "Elena," she said, because refusing to give her name would have seemed strange, and strange was the very last thing she could afford to be around this man. "You're the one everyone's been talking about." A faint, almost amused expression crossed his face. Small towns talk fast. "They do." She kept her hand on the doorframe, a small barrier between them, though she doubted it would do much good if he truly meant her harm. "I heard you're investigating the missing hikers." Something shifted behind his eyes, a flicker of surprise quickly hidden away. "You heard correctly. I hope you find them," Elena said, and she meant it, though she also silently hoped his investigation would carry him far away from her bookstore, her house, and her life. "I'm sorry, but I really do need to get to work." "Of course." He stepped back from the door, giving her space, though his eyes lingered on her a moment longer than necessary. "I may stop by the bookstore again, if that's all right." It was not a question, not really, though he had phrased it as one. Elena forced a small, polite smile. "It's a public store. You're welcome any time." He left without pressing further, walking down her porch steps with the same unhurried, powerful stillness she had noticed the day before, and Elena closed the door behind him, pressing her back against it, her heart hammering hard enough that she was certain he could probably hear it from the sidewalk. She spent the walk to work turning the encounter over in her mind, searching for some explanation that did not involve the terrifying possibility that he somehow suspected what she was. He was investigating missing hikers, that was all. He had simply been polite, simply been thorough, simply been the kind of stranger who introduced himself properly in a small town where everyone already knew everyone else's business. There was nothing more to it than that. She almost believed herself by the time she reached the bookstore. The day passed slowly, the town still humming with quiet excitement over its unusual visitor. Elena kept herself busy with customers and inventory, grateful for anything that gave her hands and mind something to focus on besides the memory of pale gray eyes studying her a little too closely. By late afternoon, she had almost managed to convince herself that the encounter that morning had been nothing more than ordinary small-town politeness. Then Nora came rushing into the bookstore just before closing, practically vibrating with excitement. "You will not believe what I just heard," she said, leaning both hands on the counter, her eyes wide. "What?" Elena asked, bracing herself without quite knowing why. "That man, Cade, the one everyone's been talking about. My cousin at the inn said he's not just some official investigator." Nora lowered her voice, glancing around as though the empty bookstore might be hiding eavesdroppers. She said the people with him, the ones who came in those black cars, they treat him like royalty. Like actual royalty. Bowing their heads when they talk to him, waiting for him to speak first before anyone else says a word. Elena's mouth went dry. "That sounds like an exaggeration." "Maybe," Nora said, clearly not convinced of her own doubt. "But my cousin doesn't usually exaggerate. She said it's like watching people around a king. Isn't that wild? I mean, what kind of king investigates missing hikers in a town like Hollow Pine?" Elena laughed, though it came out thinner than she intended. "I have no idea. Maybe he just likes hiking." Nora rolled her eyes and changed the subject, chattering on about something else entirely, and Elena nodded along, only half listening, her mind circling back again and again to the word Nora had used. King. It was a strange word, an old-fashioned word, the kind of word that belonged in the fairy tales her mother used to warn her about. Stories of hidden packs and forest kingdoms that lived just beyond the edge of ordinary human life. She thought of the scent that had clung to Cade the day before, wild and sharp beneath the clean, ordinary smell of soap and cotton. She thought of the way her own wolf had lifted its head at his presence, alert and aware in a way it had never been around another living soul. Slowly, uneasily, the pieces began arranging themselves into a shape she did not want to look at directly. What if the old stories her mother had told her, the ones about packs and territories and a hidden world of creatures like herself, were not simply cautionary tales meant to keep a frightened child in line? What if they were literal truth, and the man who had walked into her bookstore the day before was not merely investigating a string of disappearances, but was himself a part of that hidden world her mother had spent her whole life trying to keep Elena away from? The thought terrified her more than she expected, not because it seemed impossible, but because some small, buried part of her recognized it as true the moment it crossed her mind. She closed the bookstore that evening with unsteady hands, her mind replaying every detail of her 2 encounters with Cade Ashwood, searching for anything that might tell her how much danger she was truly in. She walked home along her usual route, the one that cut through the quiet residential streets before reaching the edge of town where the trees began, and it was there, in the deepening dusk, that she felt it again. That same prickling awareness along the back of her neck, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. She stopped walking and turned slowly, scanning the empty street behind her. Nothing moved, no cars passed, no pedestrians lingered nearby, and yet the feeling did not fade, did not loosen its grip on her spine even slightly. "Hello?" she called out, hating how small her voice sounded in the quiet evening air. Silence answered her, thick and heavy, broken only by the distant call of some bird settling into the trees for the night. Elena stood there a moment longer, every instinct in her screaming that she was not alone, before finally turning and continuing toward home at a slightly faster pace than before. She did not see him, not that evening, standing in the shadow of an old oak tree at the edge of the tree line, his pale gray eyes following her every step with an intensity that would have frightened her far more than the mere feeling of being watched, had she known it was there at all. Cade stood perfectly still long after Elena disappeared around the corner toward her house, his mind working through the same impossible puzzle that had occupied him since the moment he first stepped into her bookstore. Her scent had been unmistakable, layered so carefully beneath the ordinary smell of a human woman that anyone without his particular gifts would never have noticed it at all. But Cade was not an ordinary man, and his senses were not ordinary senses. Beneath the soap and the paper and the quiet, unremarkable life Elena Hartwell had built for herself, there was something wild, something that should not exist, not in a small human town on the edge of his territory, not hidden in plain sight for what his instincts told him had been years, perhaps even her entire lifetime. He had spent the better part of his adult life enforcing the old boundaries between the hidden world he ruled and the ordinary human world that existed alongside it, mostly unaware of just how close the two truly lived to one another. He had encountered many things in his years as Alpha King. He had never encountered anything quite like Elena Hartwell. The missing hikers had brought him to Hollow Pine. He had a growing suspicion that Elena might be the reason he stayed. That night, back in the quiet room he had taken at the town's only inn, Cade sat by the window for a long time, turning the mystery of her over and over in his mind. He thought of her calm, steady voice, the careful way she had held herself at a distance from him, as though she understood, on some deep instinctive level, exactly how dangerous his presence truly was. He thought of the flash of fear that had crossed her eyes the moment their gazes met over the bookstore counter, quickly hidden but not quickly enough. She knew what she was. That much was clear to him. What he did not yet understand was how she had managed to hide it for so long, and why, and from whom. He intended to find out. Whatever Elena Hartwell was hiding, and whatever reason she had for hiding it so carefully, Cade Ashwood was not a man who left mysteries unsolved, especially not mysteries that lived and breathed and worked behind the counter of a small, unremarkable bookstore, wearing the scent of a wolf beneath a mask of perfectly ordinary human skin. He closed his eyes that night with her image still fixed clearly in his mind, and for reasons he could not fully explain even to himself, sleep did not come easily to the Alpha King either. 3 days passed, and Cade did not return to the bookstore, though Elena felt his presence everywhere she went, a persistent unease that clung to the edges of her thoughts no matter how hard she tried to shake it. She told herself this was simply nerves, simply the natural result of a stranger unsettling the careful order of her life. She told herself many things during those 3 days, and believed almost none of them. On the 4th morning she woke before dawn, drenched in sweat, her heart racing from a dream she could not quite remember except for the feeling it left behind. A feeling of running through dark trees with something powerful and unseen close behind her, not chasing exactly, but following, patient and certain, as though it already knew she could not outrun it forever. She lay in bed until the gray light of morning crept through her curtains, and then she rose, dressed for work, and told herself firmly that today would be an ordinary day. It was not. She noticed the black car parked across from the bookstore the moment she turned the corner onto Maple Street, and her stomach tightened immediately. She recognized it, or recognized cars like it, the same kind that had carried Cade and his people into Hollow Pine days before. She almost turned around. She almost walked straight past the shop and kept going until she reached somewhere, anywhere else. But her mother's voice rose up in her memory, steady and clear even after 4 years of silence. Running only draws attention. Stay calm. Stay ordinary. Let them see nothing worth chasing. Elena squared her shoulders and walked into the bookstore as though her hands were not trembling at all. Cade was already inside, standing near the same history section where she had helped him days before, though this time he was not alone. A woman stood beside him, tall and composed, with sharp eyes that swept over Elena the instant she stepped through the door, taking in every detail with a thoroughness that made Elena feel as though she had been measured and catalogued in the space of a single glance. "Good morning," Elena said, forcing her voice into something bright and unremarkable, as she moved behind the counter, kneading the solid wood between herself and the two strangers studying her so intently. "Let me know if you need any help finding something." "Actually," Cade said, stepping forward with an easy, unhurried grace that did nothing to calm the frantic beating of Elena's heart. "We were hoping to ask you a few questions, if you don't mind, about the town, about the surrounding forest." "I'm not sure how much help I'll be," Elena said carefully. "I mostly stick to town. I don't go into the woods much." This was, of course, a careful lie, though not entirely false either. Elena did avoid the deep forest whenever she could help it, terrified of what she might do if her control slipped somewhere far from prying eyes, somewhere the wolf inside her might finally win the long fight it had been losing for 20 years. "Even so," the woman beside Cade said, her voice smooth and pleasant, though something sharp lived just beneath it. "You've lived here your whole life, haven't you? People who grow up somewhere notice things visitors never would." "I suppose that's true," Elena admitted, keeping her hands busy straightening a stack of receipts on the counter, anything to avoid meeting either of their eyes directly for too long. "What kind of things are you looking for?" "Anything unusual," Cade said, his pale gray eyes fixed steadily on her face. "Strange sightings, animals behaving oddly, people behaving oddly for that matter." The words landed like a blow, though Elena forced her expression to remain calm, forced her hands to keep moving in their small, ordinary task. She was almost certain in that moment that he was not truly asking about the missing hikers at all. He was asking about her, circling closer and closer with each careful question, testing to see how she would respond. "This is a quiet town," she said finally, meeting his eyes with as much steadiness as she could manage. "Nothing unusual happens here. That's rather the whole point of living somewhere like Hollow Pine." Something flickered across Cade's face, an expression she could not quite name, somewhere between amusement and something far more serious. "Is that so?" "It is," Elena said, and this time there was a note of finality in her voice that even she was surprised to hear, a small flash of the strength that lived beneath 20 years of careful hiding. The woman beside Cade glanced at him, some silent communication passing between them that Elena could not follow, and then, to her enormous relief, they thanked her for her time and left the bookstore without further questions. Elena stood behind the counter for a long moment after the door closed, her whole body trembling with the effort of having appeared calm for those few unbearable minutes. She did not know that Cade had lingered just outside the shop window, watching her through the glass as she pressed both hands flat against the counter and breathed slowly, deliberately, the way someone does when they are trying very hard to hold themselves together. She did not know that the sight of her doing so had told him more than any of his careful questions ever could have. That evening, Elena closed the bookstore early, unable to shake the feeling of exposure that had followed her through the entire day. She walked home quickly, avoiding her usual quiet route in favor of the busier main road, telling herself that more people around her meant more safety, though she was not entirely certain that was true where a man like Cade Ashwood was concerned. She was halfway home when she heard it, a low, pained whimper coming from the alley beside the hardware store, followed by the frightened cry of a small child. Elena's instincts took over before her mind had fully caught up, her feet carrying her toward the sound without conscious thought. She rounded the corner into the alley and found a little girl, no older than 6, crouched against the wall, her small hands pressed over her face, while a large stray dog paced back and forth in front of her, clearly agitated, its hackles raised and a low growl building in its throat. "Hey," Elena said softly, moving slowly, deliberately, the way her mother had taught her to move around frightened animals. "Hey, it's all right." The dog's growl deepened, its focus locking onto Elena now instead of the terrified child, and for one heart-stopping moment, Elena saw its muscles bunch beneath its fur, saw the unmistakable signs of an animal about to lunge. She did not think. She simply moved, placing herself between the dog and the little girl, her arms spread wide, every fiber of her being braced for impact. The dog leapt, and Elena's body responded with a speed and strength that no ordinary woman should have possessed, catching the animal by its collar and redirecting its momentum away from the child in one smooth, powerful motion, her grip firm enough to hold the struggling dog in place without harming it, though the effort tore a small, ragged gash into her forearm from its scrambling claws. The dog, sensing something in Elena it clearly did not wish to challenge further, went suddenly still, its aggression melting away into something closer to submission, and after a tense moment, it turned and fled down the alley, disappearing around the far corner. Elena knelt quickly beside the little girl, checking her over for injuries, relieved to find nothing more serious than fright and a few scraped knees. "You're okay," she said gently. "You're okay, sweetheart. Can you tell me your name?" "Daisy," the little girl whispered, still trembling. "Well, Daisy, you're very brave," Elena said, helping her to her feet just as a frantic voice called out from the mouth of the alley, a woman running toward them, clearly Daisy's mother, her face pale with terror. The reunion was quick and tearful, the mother thanking Elena profusely, gathering Daisy into her arms and hurrying away toward home, leaving Elena alone in the alley, breathing hard, her forearm throbbing where the dog's claws had torn her skin. She looked down at the wound, expecting blood, expecting pain that would linger for days. Instead, she watched, with a mixture of relief and horror, as the torn skin began knitting itself back together before her eyes, the wound closing far faster than any ordinary injury ever could. She had been careless. In her rush to protect the child, she had let her guard down completely, and now, standing alone in a darkening alley with her skin healing itself in plain view, Elena realized with a sinking feeling that she was no longer entirely certain she truly was alone at all. She turned slowly, scanning the shadows at the alley's far end, and this time, she was almost certain she saw a tall shape shift slightly among the deepening dark, there and then gone, silent and watchful, before she could be entirely sure it had been there at all. She hurried home that evening faster than she had in years, her heart pounding with a fear that had nothing to do with stray dogs and everything to do with pale gray eyes that seemed to see far more than any stranger's eyes ever should. Elena barely slept that night, her mind replaying the moment her skin had healed itself in the alley, over and over, each time landing on the same terrifying question. Had Cade seen it happen? Had he watched her forearm knit itself back together in seconds? Watched proof of everything her mother had warned her to hide for 20 long years. By morning, exhaustion had worn her nerves thin, and she considered, seriously this time, simply not opening the bookstore at all. But hiding felt like admitting guilt, felt like confirming whatever suspicions Cade Ashwood might already be forming about her, and so she dressed, forced down a few bites of breakfast she barely tasted, and walked to work with her shoulders squared and her chin lifted, determined to appear as unremarkable as possible. He was waiting for her outside the shop when she arrived, leaning against the brick wall beside the door with the easy patience of a man who had nowhere else in the world he needed to be. Elena's steps faltered for just a moment before she forced herself forward, unlocking the door with hands that only trembled slightly. "You're here early," she said, aiming for lightness and missing by a wide margin. "I wanted to speak with you before you opened," Cade said, straightening from the wall and following her inside as she flipped the sign on the door and moved behind the counter, needing that small barrier of solid wood between them more than ever. "About what happened yesterday. With the child." Elena's stomach dropped straight through the floor. "I don't know what you mean." "Elena." Her name in his voice was quiet, careful, entirely without accusation, and somehow that gentleness frightened her more than anger would have. "I saw the wound on your arm heal itself. I saw how fast you moved to reach that girl before the dog could touch her. Ordinary humans cannot do either of those things." She opened her mouth to deny it, some automatic protest already forming on her tongue, but the words died before she could speak them. 20 years of careful lies suddenly felt impossibly heavy, and looking into his steady gray eyes, Elena found she simply did not have the strength left to keep building them. "Please," she whispered instead, her voice cracking on the single word. "Please don't tell anyone." Something shifted in Cade's expression, softening in a way Elena had not expected from a man who carried himself with such contained, powerful authority. "I'm not here to expose you," he said. "I give you my word." "Your word means nothing to me," Elena said, though even as she said it, some instinct deep inside her, the very same instinct that had gone still and watchful the first moment she ever saw him, whispered that it was not entirely true. "I don't know you. I don't know what you are, or why you're here, or what you want from me." "Then let me explain," Cade said, and for the first time since she had met him, there was something almost vulnerable in his voice, a rare crack in his composed exterior. "I am not simply a man investigating missing hikers, Elena. I lead a community that lives largely hidden from the world you've grown up in. A community of people like you, though I suspect you already knew that." Elena's hands gripped the edge of the counter until her knuckles whitened. "My mother told me about people like you. She told me you would either want me dead or want to own me. She spent her whole life making sure neither of those things happened." Pain flickered across Cade's face, quick and genuine. "Your mother wasn't wrong to fear that. Not entirely. There are those within my world who would see someone like you as a threat, simply for existing outside the boundaries they've spent generations enforcing." He paused, choosing his next words with obvious care. "But I am not one of them, and I do not intend to become one of them." "Why should I believe that?" Elena asked, though her voice had lost some of its earlier sharpness, exhaustion and fear slowly giving way to something closer to desperate hope. "Because I have had 4 days to decide what to do about you," Cade said quietly, "and in 4 days I have done nothing but keep your secret." Silence stretched between them, filled only by the soft hum of the ceiling fan and the distant sound of a car passing outside. Elena studied his face, searching for any sign of deception, and found instead only steady, patient honesty, a quality she had not expected from a man his own community, apparently regarded as some kind of king. "What are you?" she asked finally, the question she had been avoiding since the very first moment their eyes met. "I am an alpha," Cade said simply, "the leader of a pack, and of several territories beyond it. My kind are shifters, Elena. We become wolves, much as I suspect you do, though clearly you have spent your entire life without guidance, without a pack, without anyone to teach you what you are, or how to control it safely." Elena let out a shaky breath, some enormous weight lifting from her chest even as new fears rushed in to take its place. "My mother was the only one who knew. She said our bloodline was forbidden, mixed, something the old packs hunted a long time ago, though she never told me why." Cade's expression grew troubled at this, a flicker of something like recognition crossing his pale eyes. "There are old stories," he said slowly, "about bloodlines like that. I would need to know more before I could tell you anything with certainty. But Elena, whatever you are, whatever your mother was protecting you from, I do not believe you should have to carry this burden entirely alone anymore." "You don't know me," Elena said again, though softer this time, less a wall and more a genuine, frightened question. "No," Cade agreed. "Not yet, but I would like the chance to." Elena studied him for a long moment, weighing 20 years of careful hiding against the strange, unexpected relief of finally being seen, truly seen, by someone who did not recoil in horror or reach immediately for a weapon or a phone to call the authorities. She thought of her mother's warnings, and she thought, too, of the quiet, watchful protection in Cade's gray eyes, so at odds with the danger she had always been taught to expect from people like him. "I don't know if I can trust you," she said finally, honestly. "That's fair," Cade said, and something almost like a smile touched the corner of his mouth. "I don't expect you to trust me overnight, but I would like to earn it, if you'll let me try." Before Elena could answer, the bell above the door chimed, and a customer stepped inside, an elderly man Elena recognized as one of her regulars, and the moment for confession and vulnerability closed as quickly as it had opened. Cade stepped back, giving her space to attend to her customer, though his gray eyes lingered on her a moment longer, filled with something warmer and more complicated than the wary caution he had carried into the bookstore days before. "I'll come back later," he said quietly, and then he was gone, the bell chiming softly behind him. Elena helped her customer find the book he was looking for, her hands steady now, her mind quiet in a way it had not been in days. For the first time in 20 years, someone else knew what she truly was, and rather than the disaster she had always feared, the sky had not fallen, the ground had not opened beneath her feet, and she remained, impossibly, still standing. She did not yet know how much more her life was about to change, How deeply this stranger with pale gray eyes and quiet, patient honesty would come to matter to her before this was all over. She only knew, standing alone in her small bookstore as the afternoon light shifted golden through the windows, that something inside her chest, some tightly wound coil of fear and loneliness she had carried since childhood, had finally, for the very first time, begun to loosen. Cade returned that evening, just as he had promised, and this time he brought no advisor, no watchful stranger studying Elena's every word. He arrived alone, waiting patiently outside the bookstore until she finished closing up for the night, and together they walked to a small, quiet park at the edge of town, where the evening light filtered gold and soft through the branches of old oak trees. "Tell me about your mother," Cade said as they walked, his voice gentle, careful not to push too hard against a door that had only just cracked open. "If you're willing." Elena was quiet for a long moment, gathering her thoughts, before she finally began to speak. She told him about growing up in a series of small towns, never staying anywhere for more than a few years, her mother always alert, always watching the edges of every room they entered. She told him about the exercises her mother had taught her, the breathing, the counting, the careful discipline required to keep her wolf buried so deep that even she sometimes forgot it existed at all. "She never told me where our bloodline came from," Elena admitted, "only that it was dangerous, that the old packs had hunted our kind once, generations ago, and that if anyone ever discovered what we were, we would either be killed or captured and forced into servitude." She made it sound like there was no other possible outcome. Cade's jaw tightened at this, something dark and troubled moving behind his eyes. "There is truth in what she told you, though perhaps not the whole truth. There are old laws within my world, laws written long before I became Alpha, that speak of certain forbidden bloodlines, wolves whose blood mixed with something outside the natural order of our kind. I confess I do not fully understand the details myself, but I intend to find out." "Is that dangerous for you?" Elena asked, surprising herself with the question, with how much she found herself caring about the answer. "Looking into this?" "Perhaps," Cade admitted. "There are elders within my council who value the old laws very highly, sometimes more highly than they value fairness or reason. But I did not become Alpha by avoiding difficult questions, Elena, and I do not intend to start now." They walked in comfortable silence for a while after that, and Elena found herself relaxing in a way she rarely allowed herself around anyone, let alone a man she had known for less than a week. There was something steadying about his presence, something that settled the restless, watchful part of her that never fully quieted, not even in sleep. "Can I ask you something?" she said eventually, as they settled onto a wooden bench overlooking a small, quiet pond. "Of course. Why does it feel different, being near you? My whole life, my wolf has only ever felt like something to fight against, something to lock away. But since the moment you walked into my shop, it's felt almost calm, aware, but calm. I don't understand it." Cade was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes fixed on the still water of the pond. "I have a theory," he said finally, "though I don't want to alarm you before I'm certain." "Tell me anyway." "Among my kind, certain wolves recognize one another on a level deeper than simple attraction or friendship. We call it a bond. It is rare, and it cannot be forced or chosen. It simply exists, or it does not, discovered rather than decided." He turned to look at her then, his expression carefully neutral, though something vulnerable lived just beneath it. "I have felt something unusual since the moment I first caught your scent in that bookstore. I did not want to presume what it meant, especially not while you were still learning to trust me. But if your wolf responds to my presence with calm rather than fear, it may be evidence of exactly that kind of bond." Elena's heart stumbled over itself, a strange mixture of fear and something warmer, something she did not yet have a name for, rushing through her chest. "What does that mean?" "For us? I don't know yet," Cade admitted honestly. "I have never experienced it myself before now, but I do not believe it is something either of us needs to decide tonight. I only wanted you to understand why my presence might feel different to you than any other stranger's would." Elena studied him for a long moment, this man who ruled over an entire hidden world, who could have simply reported her existence to whatever council he answered to, and walked away with his duty fulfilled, and who had instead chosen, again and again, to protect her secret and earn her trust with patience she had not expected from someone in his position. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for not treating me like something to be afraid of." "You are not something to be afraid of, Elena," Cade said, his voice low and certain. "You are simply someone who has spent far too long alone, carrying a burden no one should have to carry entirely by themselves." They stayed at the small pond until the sky deepened fully into evening, talking quietly about smaller, simpler things, Elena's favorite books, Cade's responsibilities as Alpha, the strange, unexpected comfort of finally speaking honestly with another living soul about a part of herself she had hidden her entire life. When Cade finally walked her home, he stopped at the edge of her porch, careful once again to give her the space and distance she had always relied on to keep herself safe. "I would like to see you again," he said simply, "if you're willing." "I think," Elena said slowly, testing the truth of the words even as she spoke them, "that I would like that too." He left her standing on her porch with the ghost of a smile on her lips, an unfamiliar lightness in her chest that she did not fully trust yet, but that she found, for the first time in 20 years, she did not want to push away either. Miles away, deep within the forest territory Cade governed, a very different conversation was taking place. In a large stone hall lit by firelight, an aging pack elder named Edmund Wells sat listening to a report delivered by one of Cade's watchful advisors, his weathered face growing graver with every detail he heard. "A hidden bloodline," Edmund murmured, once the advisor had finished speaking. "Living in plain sight among the humans, all this time. The Alpha King has taken a personal interest in her," the advisor added carefully. "He has not yet reported her existence to the full council." Edmund's eyes narrowed, old memories stirring behind them, memories of a prophecy nearly forgotten by all but the oldest members of their world. "If she is truly what I suspect she is," he said slowly, "then Cade's interest in her is either the greatest fortune our kind has seen in generations, or the beginning of the very disaster our ancestors gave everything to prevent." He rose from his seat by the fire, his expression troubled, decision settling heavily over his shoulders. "Send word to the others," he said finally. "Quietly, for now. It is time the full council learned what has been hiding in Hollow Pine." Far away, unaware that the wheels of an ancient prophecy had just begun turning around her, Elena Hartwell fell asleep that night for the first time in years, without the familiar, exhausting fear that had haunted her every dream since childhood, her mind instead filled with pale gray eyes, and the quiet, unfamiliar warmth of finally being known. Cade returned to his territory 3 days later, summoned by an urgent message from Edmund Wells that gave him little choice but to leave Hollow Pine, and Elena, sooner than he wished. The council hall was already full by the time he arrived, firelight flickering across the stern faces of the elders who governed the oldest laws of his world, and he knew immediately, from the weight of their collective silence, that his private investigation into Elena's bloodline had not remained private for long. "You've kept a significant discovery from this council," Edmund said without preamble, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who had outlived 3 alphas before Cade, and expected to be heard because of it. "A hidden wolf, living among humans, carrying blood our ancestors declared forbidden generations ago." "I was verifying the situation before bringing it to the council," Cade said evenly, refusing to let the old elder's tone rattle him. "I did not wish to cause alarm over incomplete information." "And now that your information is complete?" another elder asked sharply, a woman named Cora Ellison whose sharp eyes missed very little. "What have you learned?" Cade considered his next words carefully. He had spent the journey back to his territory turning over exactly how much to reveal, weighing Elena's safety against his duty to the council he served. "Her mother protected her from birth," he said finally. "She has lived her entire life without guidance, without pack, suppressing her nature out of fear rather than training. She has harmed no one. She poses no threat to this territory or its people." "That is not the concern," Edmund said, rising slowly from his seat, his weathered hands folded before him. "Cade, do you know the origin of the old law forbidding bloodlines like hers?" "I know only fragments," Cade admitted. "That such mixing was declared dangerous generations ago, though I have never known the full reasoning behind it." Edmund's expression grew heavier, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of a story kept carefully hidden for longer than Cade had been alive. "There exists an old prophecy, Cade, nearly forgotten by all but the eldest among us, speaking of a hidden bloodline that would one day awaken fully in the presence of a true alpha, and that this awakening would mark either the ruin of our world's fragile peace, or its complete renewal. Our ancestors, fearing the former far more than they hoped for the latter, chose to forbid such bloodlines entirely, hunting them nearly to extinction rather than risk the prophecy's darker outcome." Cade felt something cold settle in his chest at these words. "You believe Elena is connected to this prophecy?" "I believe it is a possibility this council cannot afford to ignore," Cora said firmly. "And I believe your own growing attachment to her, Cade, may be exactly the catalyst our ancestors feared most." "You speak as though I have already decided her fate," Cade said, a sharp edge entering his voice for the first time since the meeting began. "I have made no such decision. I have simply refused to condemn a woman for the circumstances of her birth. circumstances she did not choose and could not control. And if her awakening brings ruin instead of renewal? Edmund asked quietly. Are you prepared for that consequence, Cade? Are you prepared to have caused it yourself? Cade held the old elder's gaze steadily, refusing to look away even as uncertainty churned beneath his composed exterior. I am prepared to judge her by her actions, not by an old fear my ancestors never fully understood themselves. If this council wishes to condemn her before she has done anything to deserve it, then this council is choosing fear over justice, and I will not be part of that choice. A heavy silence fell over the hall, broken finally by Edmund's slow, measured voice. Then perhaps, Alpha King, it falls to you to prove your judgment sound. Bring her before this council. Let us see for ourselves what she truly is, before further decisions are made regarding her fate. It was not quite the ultimatum Cade had feared, but it was close enough to send a fresh wave of unease through him. Bringing Elena before the full council meant exposing her to elders who already viewed her existence with deep suspicion. Elders who held enough collective authority to override even his own considerable power if they judged her a genuine threat. And yet refusing outright would only deepen their suspicion further, casting Cade himself as someone unwilling to submit his own judgment to proper scrutiny. A dangerous position for even an Alpha King to occupy. I will speak with her, Cade said finally, choosing his words with careful precision. The decision of whether to appear before this council must be hers to make, not mine to force upon her. Edmund inclined his head slowly, accepting this compromise, though his expression remained troubled. See that it happens soon, Cade. Word of a hidden bloodline does not stay contained within these walls forever, no matter how carefully we guard it. If others learn of her before this council has properly assessed her, I fear we will lose all ability to control what happens next. Cade left the council hall that evening with a heaviness settled deep in his chest, the weight of responsibility pressing down harder than it had in years. He thought of Elena's careful, hard-won trust, built slowly over days of patient honesty, and he thought of how easily that trust might shatter the moment she learned an entire council of ancient wolves now debated her fate behind closed doors. He thought, too, of the strange warmth that had settled over him during their evening at the pond, the quiet, unfamiliar sense of rightness he felt in her presence, unlike anything he had experienced with any other living soul in his considerably long life. Whatever the old prophecy claimed about ruin or renewal, Cade found he could not bring himself to view Elena as a danger, not when every instinct beyond the fearful whispers of ancient law told him she was simply a woman who deserved far better than the frightened, isolated life she had been forced to live. He returned to Hollow Pine 2 days later, his mind still turning over exactly how much to tell her, and found Elena waiting for him outside the bookstore as the evening light faded gold and soft across Maple Street, an anxious, searching expression already forming on her face the moment she caught sight of him. Something's wrong, she said immediately, reading the tension in his shoulders with an accuracy that told him just how attuned to him she had already become in such a short time. What happened? Cade studied her for a long moment, weighing honesty against protection, and found, as he always seemed to find where Elena was concerned, that he could not bring himself to choose deception over truth. We need to talk, he said quietly, about my counsel, and about a prophecy older than either of us, that I fear now concerns you directly. Elena's face paled slightly, but she did not flinch away from him, did not retreat into the careful, guarded distance she had kept for the first days of their acquaintance. Instead, she straightened her shoulders, met his eyes steadily, and said, with a quiet strength that reminded him exactly why he had refused to abandon her to his counsel's fearful judgment. Then tell me everything. I've spent 20 years hiding from the truth about myself. I'm done running from it now. Cade told her everything that evening, sitting across from her at the small kitchen table in her modest home, the lights dimmed low against the darkness gathering outside. He told her about the old prophecy, about the forbidden bloodline his ancestors had hunted out of fear generations before either of them was born, about the words that spoke of ruin or renewal depending entirely on how her awakening unfolded. Elena listened in silence, her hands wrapped tightly around a cup of tea that had long since gone cold, absorbing each piece of information with a steadiness that surprised even herself. When Cade finally finished speaking, the kitchen fell quiet except for the soft ticking of the clock on her wall. So your counsel thinks I might destroy your world, she said finally, her voice carefully even, though Cade could hear the tremor she was working hard to suppress beneath it. Simply because of who my mother happened to be. They fear the possibility, Cade said gently. They do not know you, Elena. I do, even if only a little, and what I know does not match the fear they're holding on to. But they want to see me anyway, judge me for themselves. Yes, Cade admitted. Edmund has requested it. I told him the choice would be yours to make, not mine to force upon you. Elena was quiet for a long moment, staring down into her cold tea, before she finally looked up and met his eyes with a clarity that steadied something uncertain in his own chest. "If I refuse, what happens?" "I don't know for certain," Cade said honestly, "but I suspect refusal would only deepen their suspicion. Word of your existence is already spreading through my world, whether either of us wishes it or not. Hiding further may no longer be a choice available to you." Elena let out a long, slow breath. 20 years of careful, practiced hiding warring visibly with something new and unfamiliar rising up beneath it, something that looked, to Cade's careful eye, remarkably like courage. "Then I'll go," she said finally. "I'm tired of being afraid, Cade. My mother spent her whole life terrified of exactly this moment, and it still found me anyway. I would rather face it standing up than keep running from something that's clearly going to catch me eventually." Something in Cade's chest loosened at her words, admiration and relief tangling together into an emotion he did not fully have a name for yet. "I will be there with you," he said firmly. "Whatever they decide, you will not face them alone." They settled on a date 3 days later for Elena to travel into Cade's territory and appear before the full council, and in the time leading up to it, Elena found her nights growing steadily more restless, her wolf stirring with an intensity she had never experienced before, as though it sensed the significance of what was coming and refused to remain quietly buried any longer. She noticed the changes first in small ways, her eyes catching the light strangely in the bathroom mirror one morning, flashing gold for just a heartbeat before fading back to their ordinary brown. Her senses sharpening further than they ever had before, catching sounds and scents from impossible distances, the whole world suddenly louder and richer and more overwhelming than she had ever experienced it. "It's getting harder to control," she admitted to Cade during one of their evening walks, 2 days before she was due to appear before his council. "I don't understand why now, after 20 years of managing it just fine. I believe it's because of the bond between us," Cade said carefully. "Proximity to a true alpha can sometimes draw a suppressed wolf toward the surface, especially one that has been forcibly contained for as long as yours has. Your body may finally sense it is safe enough, or perhaps significant enough, to stop fighting so hard against its own nature." "Is that dangerous?" Elena asked, unable to keep the thread of fear from her voice. "It can be," Cade admitted honestly, unwilling to offer false comfort where the truth mattered more. "An awakening after so many years of suppression can be overwhelming, even violent, if it isn't approached carefully. But I don't believe you need to fear losing yourself entirely, Elena. Whatever comes when your wolf finally surfaces fully, I believe it will still be you underneath it." Elena wanted desperately to believe him, and found, walking beside him through the quiet evening streets of Hollow Pine, that she very nearly did. But that night, alone in her house with the full weight of everything ahead of her pressing down hard on her chest, the fear returned in full force. 20 years of careful discipline feeling suddenly fragile and inadequate against whatever was building steadily beneath her skin. She dreamed that night of running through dark trees again, the same dream that had haunted her for years, except this time, for the very first time, the presence following her through the darkness did not feel threatening at all. It felt familiar. It felt, impossibly, like coming home. She woke before dawn with her heart racing, not from fear this time, but from something that felt disturbingly close to anticipation, and lay in the darkness turning over Cade's words from the evening before. "Whatever comes when your wolf finally surfaces fully, I believe it will still be you underneath it." She wanted, more than she had wanted almost anything in her careful, controlled life, for that to be true. The following day passed in a haze of nervous preparation, Elena arranging for Nora to cover the bookstore under the vague explanation of a family matter requiring her attention out of town, packing a small bag with hands that would not quite stop trembling, rehearsing in her mind again and again the calm, steady composure she intended to present before an entire council of ancient wolves prepared to judge her existence. Cade arrived at dusk to collect her, dressed now in clothing that carried a subtle formality Elena had not seen from him before. A quiet reminder that where they were traveling, he was not simply a man who had wandered into her bookstore, but a king returning to his court, bringing with him a discovery his people were desperate to understand. "Are you ready?" he asked gently, studying her face with careful attention as she locked her front door behind her for what felt, in that anxious moment, like it might be the last ordinary evening of her life. "No," Elena admitted honestly, managing a small, unsteady smile despite the fear coiling tight in her stomach. "But I'm going anyway." Cade's expression softened with something that looked remarkably like pride. "That," he said quietly, "is exactly the kind of courage that makes me certain the old prophecy has nothing to fear from you." Elena held on to those words as they began the long drive toward his territory. the town of Hollow Pine shrinking behind them, and the deep, ancient forest that had haunted her childhood imagination finally rising up ahead, dark and vast and waiting, ready at last to reveal every secret it had kept hidden from her for the whole of her careful, guarded life. The road into Cade's territory wound deeper and deeper into forest so old and dense that Elena felt the ordinary world of Hollow Pine falling away behind her with every passing mile. By the time the car finally slowed before a sprawling stone hall lit by torchlight, her nerves had wound themselves so tight she could hardly draw a full breath. Cade reached over and took her hand before she could open the car door, his grip warm and steady. "Whatever happens in there," he said quietly, "you are not alone. Remember that." Elena nodded, drawing strength from his steady presence, and together they walked up the wide stone steps into the council hall, where firelight danced across the weathered faces of elders who had already gathered, watching her entrance with an intensity that made her skin prickle. Edmund Wells rose first, his old eyes studying Elena with an unreadable expression as she came to stand before the assembled council, Cade steady at her side. "So," he said finally, his voice carrying easily through the silent hall, "this is the hidden wolf, who has caused our Alpha King so much careful consideration." "My name is Elena," she said, proud of how steady her own voice sounded despite the fear hammering beneath her ribs. "I did not choose to be born into this bloodline, and I did not choose the fear that forced my mother to hide me my entire life. But I am standing before you now because I refuse to keep hiding any longer." A murmur passed through the gathered elders at her words, and Cora Ellison leaned forward slightly, her sharp eyes narrowing with interest rather than open hostility. Bold words, for someone who has spent her whole existence in hiding. "Perhaps," Elena said, meeting the woman's gaze without flinching. "But I've had 20 years to learn discipline, and I've had 1 week to learn that hiding costs more than it protects." Edmund studied her for a long, weighty moment before speaking again. "The prophecy speaks of an awakening, one that occurs in the presence of a true alpha, and that this awakening reveals the truth of what such a bloodline will become. Are you aware, Elena, that your own wolf has begun stirring more strongly since arriving here?" Elena's breath caught, because she had indeed felt it, an intensifying pressure building beneath her skin from the moment she stepped out of the car, stronger now than it had been even during her restless nights in Hollow Pine. "I feel it," she admitted. "I don't fully understand it, but I'm not afraid to let you see it, if that's what this council requires to judge me fairly." A tense silence followed her words, elders exchanging uncertain glances, until Edmund finally nodded slowly. "Very well," he said. "Let us see then, exactly what has been hiding among the humans all these years." Elena closed her eyes, drawing on every ounce of the careful discipline her mother had taught her, except this time, instead of pushing the fire beneath her skin back down into hiding, she did something she had never once allowed herself to do in 20 years of careful suppression. She let go. The transformation that followed was unlike anything Elena had ever experienced, a rush of heat and light, an impossible sensation flooding through every part of her body at once, her bones and muscles shifting with a speed that should have been agonizing, and instead felt strangely, overwhelmingly like relief, like a held breath finally released after 20 long years of holding it. When it was over, Elena stood before the stunned council not as a frightened woman anymore, but as a wolf of striking silver-gray fur, larger and more powerful than any of the assembled elders had clearly expected, her golden eyes steady and unafraid as she met each of their gazes in turn. The hall fell into absolute silence, broken finally by Edmund's low, awed voice. "Remarkable," he murmured. "In all my long years, I have never witnessed an awakening so complete, so controlled." Elena shifted back slowly, the transformation reversing with the same strange, overwhelming rush of sensation, until she stood once again as herself, breathing hard but steady, Cade's hand immediately finding hers to help her balance. "She is no threat to this council," Cade said firmly, his voice carrying clearly through the hall. "You have all just witnessed proof of exactly that." Edmund studied Elena for a long moment, something shifting behind his weathered eyes, old fear slowly giving way to something that looked remarkably like hope. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "our ancestors misunderstood the prophecy entirely. Perhaps it was never meant to warn of ruin at all, but simply to prepare us for a reunion long overdue, between bloodlines that should never have been separated by fear in the first place." A murmur of cautious agreement rippled through the gathered elders, and Elena felt, for the first time since stepping through those heavy stone doors, the tight coil of fear in her chest finally begin to loosen. But not everyone in the hall shared Edmund's newfound optimism. Near the back of the assembly, a sharp-eyed man named Victor Lang, watched the proceedings with an expression far darker than the cautious hope spreading through the rest of the council, his jaw tight, his hands curled into fists at his sides. He had spent years building influence among those elders who still clung fiercely to the old fears, and he had no intention of allowing one impressive display of control to undo generations of carefully preserved caution. He slipped quietly from the hall before the meeting fully concluded, already turning over in his mind exactly how he intended to make certain the old fear surrounding Elena's bloodline did not fade so easily, no matter how convincing her awakening had appeared to the rest of the council. Elena, unaware of the danger already gathering against her, allowed herself, for the first time in her entire guarded life, to simply feel the quiet, overwhelming relief of being seen fully and accepted, at least by most of those who mattered, standing beside Cade with her hand still held firmly in his. 20 years of hiding finally beginning to fall away like a burden she no longer needed to carry alone. The relief following Elena's appearance before the council lasted only a handful of days before trouble found her again, sharper and more immediate than anything she had faced before. She and Cade had returned briefly to Hollow Pine to collect the remainder of her belongings, planning a more permanent move into his territory now that her secret had been laid bare before those who mattered most, when Nora came rushing into the bookstore late one afternoon, her face pale with worry. "There were men asking about you," Nora said breathlessly. "Strange men, Elena. They came into the flower shop asking questions, where you lived, who you spent your time with. They didn't feel right. I told them nothing, but I thought you should know." Elena's stomach dropped, old fear rising instantly to the surface despite everything she had gained over the past week. She relayed the information to Cade the moment he returned to the bookstore, watching his expression darken with a controlled anger she had not seen from him before. "Victor Lang," Cade said grimly, once she described the little Nora had managed to observe. "He opposed the council's decision from the beginning. I should have anticipated he would not simply accept defeat quietly." "What does he want?" Elena asked, though some instinctive part of her already suspected the answer. "To prevent your bloodline from ever fully awakening among our people," Cade said. "Whether that means capturing you, or something far worse, I do not intend to find out through waiting." They left Hollow Pine that same evening, Cade determined to move Elena into the protected heart of his territory before Victor's people could make any further attempt against her. But Victor, it seemed, had anticipated exactly this response, and their car had barely crossed back into the forest territory before it was forced to a sudden, jarring stop, the road ahead blocked by several vehicles and a small group of armed figures emerging from the tree line. "Stay behind me," Cade said sharply, already moving to place himself between Elena and the approaching threat as they stepped from the car. Victor Lang stood at the front of the group, his expression cold and resolute. "This does not have to become difficult, Cade," he said. "Hand her over quietly, and this ends without further complication." "You have no authority to make demands of this kind," Cade said, his voice carrying the full, dangerous weight of his position as Alpha King. "The council has already ruled on this matter." "The council ruled based on a performance," Victor spat. "I will not risk generations of careful order on the strength of one controlled transformation, however impressive it appeared." Elena felt her heart pounding wildly as the tense standoff stretched between the two groups, 20 years of careful discipline suddenly feeling desperately inadequate against the very real danger now surrounding them. She felt her wolf stirring beneath her skin again, stronger and more insistent than ever, no longer content to remain quietly hidden while genuine danger threatened the one person who had finally made her feel safe enough to stop running. "Elena," Cade said quietly, without turning from Victor's group, clearly sensing the shift building within her. "Whatever happens, trust yourself." Victor's people moved first, and chaos erupted swiftly through the clearing, though Cade fought with the practiced, powerful discipline of a man who had led his people through countless dangers before. Elena, cornered suddenly by two of Victor's men closing in from either side, felt the last threads of her careful control finally snap entirely, 20 years of suppression giving way at last to something ancient and powerful rising up from deep within her. The transformation swept through her faster and more completely than it had even before the council, her body shifting seamlessly into her wolf form, silver-gray fur catching the moonlight as she moved with a speed and grace that startled even the men who had come prepared to subdue her. She did not attack, exactly, understanding instinctively that harming Victor's people would only prove the very fears the council had worked so hard to set aside. Instead, she moved between them and Cade with fluid, decisive purpose, her presence alone enough to make the attacking men hesitate, uncertain suddenly of exactly what they had underestimated. Victor himself froze at the sight of her, something like genuine fear finally crossing his features as he watched the full, controlled power of her awakened wolf standing steady and unafraid before him. "This is exactly what the prophecy warned against," he said, though his voice carried less conviction now than it had moments before. "No," Cade said firmly, moving to stand beside Elena's wolf form, his hand resting with quiet confidence against her fur. "This is exactly what the prophecy promised, if only your fear had allowed you to see it clearly. A bloodline strong enough to stand beside us, rather than one we needed to fear at all." The standoff broke slowly after that, Victor's people retreating under the combined, unmistakable authority of their Alpha King and the powerful controlled wolf, standing steadily beside him. And Victor himself finally withdrew, his expression troubled, clearly recognizing that whatever fear had driven his opposition, it could not withstand the plain evidence now standing before him. Elena shifted back slowly once the danger had fully passed, exhausted but steady, Cade's arms coming around her immediately to help her find her balance. "You did it," he said softly, pride and relief mingling clearly in his voice. "You controlled the full awakening, even under genuine threat." "I trusted myself," Elena said, echoing his own words back to him, a tired but genuine smile finally breaking through the last of her fear. "Just like you told me to." They returned to Cade's territory that night without further incident, word of the confrontation spreading quickly among his people, carrying with it a very different story than the fearful whispers that had first accompanied Elena's discovery. No longer simply a hidden bloodline to be feared and debated, Elena had become, in the space of one dangerous evening, living proof that the old prophecy's darkest fears had been built on generations of misunderstanding, rather than genuine danger at all. Word of the confrontation reached the full council within days, and this time, when Edmund Wells called Elena and Cade before the assembled elders once more, the atmosphere in the great stone hall had shifted entirely from wary suspicion into something far closer to genuine welcome. Even Victor Lang, present among the gathered council though considerably subdued from his earlier defiance, offered Elena a stiff but sincere nod of acknowledgement as she and Cade took their places before the assembly. "We have reconsidered the old prophecy at length these past days," Edmund began, his weathered voice carrying clearly through the silent hall, "and we believe now that our ancestors, in their fear, misread its true meaning entirely. The awakening was never meant to herald destruction. It was meant to herald reunion, a joining of bloodlines our own fear had kept needlessly divided for generations." Elena felt Cade's hand tighten gently around hers as Edmund continued, the old elder's gaze moving between them with something that looked remarkably like approval. "Elena Hartwell, you have shown this council both extraordinary control and extraordinary courage, qualities our world has sorely lacked in dealing with fears we ourselves created through generations of misunderstanding. It is the decision of this council that your bloodline be welcomed fully into our world, no longer forbidden, no longer hunted, but honored as it should have been from the very beginning." A wave of quiet, relieved emotion swept through Elena at these words. 20 years of careful hiding finally, completely dissolving into something she had never truly believed she would experience in her lifetime, genuine belonging. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion she no longer needed to hide, "for giving me the chance to prove that fear was never the answer my mother believed it to be." Cora Ellison rose from her seat, addressing the gathered council with quiet authority. "There is one further matter this council must acknowledge," she said, her sharp eyes moving between Elena and Cade with obvious understanding. "The bond that exists between our Alpha King and this remarkable woman. Such bonds are rare among our kind, and they are never to be taken lightly, nor denied." Cade turned to Elena then, his pale gray eyes steady and warm, holding a question he had clearly been waiting to ask until the moment felt entirely right. "Elena Hartwell," he said quietly, though his voice carried easily through the attentive silence of the hall, "you came into my life as a mystery I could not ignore, and you have become, in the short time since, someone I cannot imagine my life without. Whatever the council decides, whatever challenges still lie ahead of us, I would be honored to face them all standing beside you, not as alpha and stranger, but as true mates, bonded fully and completely." Elena felt tears rise unbidden to her eyes, 20 years of careful, guarded loneliness giving way entirely to the overwhelming warmth of finally, truly belonging somewhere, to someone, without fear of what discovery might cost her. "Yes," she said simply, her voice steady despite the emotion coursing through her. "I would be honored too." The hall erupted into quiet, approving murmurs, even the most skeptical of the gathered elders, softening visibly at the sight of their Alpha King finding, at last, the rare and genuine bond so few among their kind ever truly experienced. Edmund Wells himself allowed a small, satisfied smile to cross his weathered features, Decades of careful, fearful tradition finally giving way to something far more hopeful than his ancestors had ever dared imagine possible. In the months that followed, Elena settled fully into Cade's territory, learning at last everything her mother had never been able to safely teach her, guided by pack members eager to help her understand and embrace a nature she had spent 20 years fighting against in fearful isolation. She learned to shift with ease and confidence, to run freely through the ancient forest that had once haunted her childhood imagination, discovering joy rather than danger in a part of herself she had never been allowed to fully know before. She married Cade Ashwood beneath the very same old oak trees where they had first spoken honestly of the strange, unexpected bond drawing them together, surrounded by pack members who had come, in time, to see her not as a feared unknown, but as their true and rightful queen. Victor Lang himself attended the ceremony, his earlier opposition long since replaced by quiet respect for the woman whose courage had ultimately proven every fearful assumption about her bloodline wrong. Elena thought often, in the peaceful months that followed, of her mother, of the careful, frightened woman who had spent her entire life teaching her daughter to hide rather than to hope. She wished, with a bittersweet ache that never fully faded, that her mother could have lived to see this ending, to understand that the terrible fate she had spent her whole life dreading had transformed instead into something neither of them could ever have imagined. Not ruin, but renewal. Not fear, but belonging. Not a secret to be buried forever, but a truth finally, completely set free. Standing beside Cade one quiet evening, watching the sun set gold and warm over the vast forest territory she now called home, Elena finally allowed herself to release the last remnants of 20 years of careful hiding, replacing them instead with the steady, unshakable peace of a woman who had stopped running from herself, and had found, at the very end of that long and frightened journey, exactly where she was always meant to belong,